In 1905, a wealthy American family gathered in their garden for what should have been an ordinary photograph. Over a century later, when artificial intelligence brought new life to that faded image, it unveiled something that defies explanation, a presence that was never supposed to be there. This is a story about technology uncovering mysteries that perhaps should have remained hidden in the shadows of time. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Thomas Brennan had been working as a digital restoration specialist for nearly 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter on that cold February afternoon in 2024. His small office in Portland, Oregon, was cluttered with monitors displaying countless vintage photographs, sepia-toned faces from bygone eras, each one telling a silent story of lives long concluded. The photograph arrived via email from Eleanor Whitmore, an elderly woman from Boston who had inherited boxes of family memorabilia from her recently deceased aunt. Among dusty letters and worn jewelry, she had found this particular image, a formal family portrait dated 1905, taken at the Whitmore estate in rural Massachusetts. The photograph was severely degraded, its surface cracked and faded, the faces barely distinguishable through the fog of time. Eleanor's request was simple. She wanted to see her ancestors clearly, to preserve their memory before the photograph deteriorated beyond recognition. Thomas had handled hundreds of similar requests. He would scan the image at high resolution, then use advanced AI restoration software to reconstruct the missing details, enhance the clarity, and breathe new life into the forgotten moment. The original photograph showed 5 figures standing in front of an impressive Victorian mansion. The background revealed a manicured garden with rose bushes and a stone fountain. The family members wore the formal attire typical of the Edwardian era, the men in dark suits with high collars, the women in elaborate dresses with corseted waists and high necklines. Their poses were rigid, as was customary for photographs of that period, when subjects had to remain perfectly still for several seconds to avoid blurring. Thomas began the restoration process methodically. He imported the high-resolution scan into his specialized software, which used machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of period photographs. The AI would analyze the degraded pixels, cross-reference them with similar images from the era, and intelligently reconstruct what the original details likely looked like. The first pass took about 20 minutes. As the progress bar reached completion, Thomas leaned forward, expecting to see the usual result: sharper faces, clearer clothing details, enhanced contrast. What appeared on his screen made him pause. The 5 family members were now clearly visible. A stern-looking patriarch with a thick mustache, his wife with an elaborate upswept hairstyle, 2 teenage daughters in matching white dresses, and a young son of perhaps 10 years old. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes staring directly at the camera with the intensity common to long-exposure photography. But there was something else. Between the mother and the eldest daughter, partially obscured by the daughter's shoulder, was another figure. Thomas blinked, adjusting his glasses. The AI had reconstructed what appeared to be a 6th person, someone who hadn't been visible in the original degraded image. This figure was different. While the 5 family members stood in clear focus with sharp details, this 6th presence seemed somehow less defined, as though existing in a different plane of reality within the same photograph. Thomas zoomed in, his heart rate quickening. The face was that of a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair and pale skin. Her expression was unlike the formal poses of the others. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, and most disturbing of all, while the family members gazed stoically at the camera, this woman's eyes seemed to look past the lens, directly at the viewer, with an intensity that made Thomas uncomfortable. He ran the restoration again. thinking perhaps the algorithm had made an error, creating a phantom from damaged pixels, a digital pareidolia where the software saw patterns that didn't truly exist. But the second pass produced the same result. The sixth figure remained consistently positioned in the same location with the same unsettling expression. Thomas spent the next hour researching the Whitmore family. Public records showed that the family consisted of exactly 5 members in 1905: James Whitmore, the patriarch and a successful textile merchant, his wife Catherine, their daughters Margaret and Elizabeth, and their son Henry. No mention of any other family member, servant or guest who might have been present for the photograph. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. He examined the photograph more closely. The mysterious figure's clothing matched the period perfectly. A dark dress with the characteristic high collar and long sleeves of the era. But there were subtle anomalies. The lighting on her face didn't quite match the others. While the family cast clear shadows on the ground behind them, this sixth figure seemed to cast no shadow at all. Thomas saved his work and composed an email to Eleanor Whitmore. He attached the restored image, but hesitated before explaining what he had found. How do you tell someone that their family photograph contains an impossible presence? He chose his words carefully, describing the additional figure as an unexpected detail revealed by the restoration process, and asking if Eleanor had any knowledge of who this person might be. He pressed send, then sat back in his chair, staring at the image on his screen. The young woman's eyes seemed to follow him no matter where he moved. Thomas had restored thousands of photographs, had seen countless faces from the past, brought back to clarity, but he had never felt this particular sensation. The uncomfortable feeling that someone from 1905 was looking directly at him, across more than a century of time, trying to communicate something urgent. As evening fell over Portland, Thomas turned off his monitors and left the office. But the image of that face, pale, intense, impossible, followed him home, lingering in his thoughts like an unanswered question hanging in the cold February air. 3 days passed before Eleanor Whitmore replied to Thomas's email. When her response finally arrived on a Monday morning, Thomas opened it immediately, coffee in hand, preparing himself for either a logical explanation or confusion about the mysterious sixth figure. What he read made his coffee grow cold, untouched. Eleanor's email was longer than he had anticipated, written in the careful prose of someone educated in an earlier era. She was 78 years old, she explained, and the photograph had been taken 46 years before her birth. She had never met any of the people in the image. They were her great-grandparents, great-aunt and great-uncles, all deceased before she came into the world. But the sixth figure, the young woman revealed by the AI restoration, was not entirely unknown to her. Eleanor wrote that family stories, passed down through whispered conversations and fragmentary mentions, had always hinted at a tragedy connected to the Whitmore estate. Her great-aunt Margaret, one of the daughters in the photograph, had mentioned someone named Rose during her final years, when age had loosened the constraints of long-held family secrets. Rose had been a young woman employed at the Whitmore household in 1905, though her exact role remained unclear in Eleanor's fragmented knowledge. Margaret had spoken of her only once, during a moment of confusion in her final days at a nursing home in 1982, saying something that had puzzled the young Eleanor at the time. Rose never left the garden. She's still waiting in the photograph. And at the time, Eleanor had dismissed this as the rambling of a 93-year-old mind deteriorating under the weight of dementia. But seeing the restored photograph now, with that sixth figure staring out from between the family members, Eleanor wondered if her great-aunt's words had carried more truth than anyone realized. Thomas read the email twice, then began his own investigation. He searched historical records for the Whitmore estate, finding property documents and newspaper archives from Massachusetts in the early 1900s. The estate had been substantial, a 3-story Victorian mansion on 15 acres with extensive gardens, a carriage house, and staff quarters. In the archives of the local historical society, accessed through their digitized database, Thomas found a brief newspaper article from October 1905, just 6 months after the family photograph had been taken. The headline read, "Tragedy at Whitmore Estate, young woman found deceased." The article was short, constrained by the journalistic standards and social sensitivities of the era. It reported that Rose Callahan, age 22, an employee of the Whitmore household, had been found deceased in the estate's garden near the stone fountain. The cause of death was listed as accidental, though the article provided no specific details. The piece noted that Miss Callahan had been a quiet and devoted member of the household staff, and that the family mourns this unexpected loss. Thomas felt a chill despite the warmth of his heated office. He pulled up the restored photograph again, zooming in on the stone fountain, visible in the background. The 6th figure, Rose, if that's truly who she was, stood positioned almost directly in front of where the fountain would be, as though she had never left that spot. He contacted Eleanor again, sharing what he had discovered. Her response came quickly this time, and she included an attachment, a scan of an old letter she had found among her aunt's papers. The letter was dated December 1905, written by Catherine Whitmore to her sister in New York. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the tone troubled. Catherine wrote about the difficulty of maintaining normalcy after the incident with the girl. She mentioned that the household staff were unsettled, that some had left their positions, claiming they heard sounds in the garden at night. Most telling was a single line that Catherine had underlined. "I cannot shake the feeling that she blames us, though we did nothing wrong." Thomas researched further, but found no additional information about Rose Callahan's death. No death certificate was publicly available, no follow-up newspaper articles, no mention in local death records beyond the basic fact of her passing. It was as though the young woman had simply ceased to exist, her story deliberately erased or carefully hidden. Leave a comment about what you think about this story so far. He examined the photograph again with professional scrutiny, looking for signs of manipulation or double exposure, common techniques in early photography that could explain the anomalous figure. But everything appeared consistent with a single exposure. The lighting, the shadows, the focus, all suggested this was one moment captured in time, not a composite or manipulation. The most unsettling aspect was something Thomas couldn't quite articulate. He had worked with countless photographs from this era, had seen every type of photographic artifact and imperfection that old images could present. But there was something about Rose's expression, about the way her eyes seemed focused with such intensity, that didn't match the photographic limitations of 1905. Early cameras required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds. Subjects had to remain perfectly still, which is why people in old photographs often look so rigid and expressionless. Any movement would create blur. Yet Rose's face, while slightly less defined than the Whitmore family members, showed an expression of urgency, almost of movement, as though she had been captured in a different moment entirely, or had moved during the exposure in a way that should have rendered her invisible, but instead made her somehow more present. Thomas printed the photograph, something he rarely did with his restoration work. He pinned it to his corkboard, where it remained visible from his desk. Throughout the day, he found his eyes drawn back to it, to Rose's pale face emerging from the space between the living family members, her dark eyes holding secrets that 119 years hadn't managed to erase. That night, Thomas dreamed of a garden with a stone fountain, of roses blooming in sepia tones, and of a young woman who stood perfectly still, waiting for something that never came. Thomas couldn't let it go. The photograph of the Whitmore family, with its impossible 6th figure, occupied his thoughts even when he should have been focusing on other projects. He found himself researching Rose Callahan obsessively, searching through digital archives, contacting historical societies, and reaching out to genealogy experts who specialized in early 20th century Massachusetts. The information he uncovered was frustratingly sparse, but each small detail added another layer to the mystery. Rose had been born in 1883 in Boston to Irish immigrant parents. Her father was a dock worker who died in an industrial accident when she was 12. Her mother succumbed to tuberculosis 3 years later. By 16, Rose was working as domestic help for wealthy Boston families, moving from household to household until she found a position at the Whitmore estate in 1903. For 2 years, she worked there with apparently no incident. References in household account books showed regular wages paid to her. A brief mention in Catherine Whitmore's diary from 1904, which Thomas found excerpted in a historical society publication, described Rose as diligent and unobtrusive, with a particular talent for maintaining the gardens. Then, in October 1905, she was dead. The official record said accidental, but Thomas found something that suggested the story was more complex. In a letter to the local constable, now preserved in the town's historical archives, James Whitmore had written requesting that the investigation into Rose's death be closed promptly. He cited the family's reputation and standing in the community, and suggested that further inquiry would serve no purpose given the obvious tragic accident. What accident? The constable's brief report, which Thomas obtained through a request to the Historical Society, mentioned only that Rose had been found near the fountain with no signs of struggle or foul play. No specific cause of death was listed. No witnesses were recorded. The investigation, such as it was, lasted less than 2 days before being closed. Thomas shared his findings with Eleanor, who had become equally invested in uncovering the truth. She began her own investigation from the Boston end, contacting distant relatives and family friends, asking about old stories and forgotten memories. What Eleanor discovered added a darker dimension to the mystery. She spoke with the granddaughter of a woman who had worked at the Whitmore estate in 1905, a housemaid named Mary Sullivan. Mary had left her position shortly after Rose's death and had rarely spoken of her time at the estate, but in her final years, she had told her granddaughter something disturbing. According to Mary's account, passed down through 3 generations, Rose had been involved romantically with Henry Whitmore, the young son in the photograph, who would have been 17 at the time. The relationship, if it could be called that, was entirely inappropriate given their different social stations and her position as a servant in his family's household. Mary had suggested that Rose's death was not an accident, but something far more deliberate, though she never explicitly stated what she believed had happened. Mary had also mentioned something strange. In the weeks before Rose's death, she had seemed preoccupied with a family photograph that had been taken that spring. Rose had asked to see it multiple times, staring at it with an intensity that made Mary uncomfortable. Rose had said, according to Mary's recollection, that the photograph knows the truth. Thomas felt a deep unease reading Eleanor's account. The photograph knows the truth. What could that possibly mean? Photographs were inert objects, chemical reactions on paper capturing light. They couldn't know anything. Yet here was this image, restored by artificial intelligence more than a century later, revealing a figure that had been hidden in the degraded original. A figure whose very presence seemed to challenge the official story of Rose Callahan's life and death. Thomas decided to experiment. Using the same AI restoration software, he processed other period photographs from his collection, images from the same era with similar degradation patterns. None revealed hidden figures or unexpected presences. The algorithms worked as intended, clarifying and enhancing what was already there without creating phantom images. He processed the Whitmore photograph multiple times using different AI models and restoration techniques. Each time, Rose appeared in exactly the same position, with the same expression, her eyes carrying the same disturbing intensity. The AI wasn't creating her from nothing. It was revealing something that had always been present in the photograph, hidden in the damaged and faded emulsion, waiting for technology that wouldn't exist for another 119 years to bring it to light. Thomas began to form a theory, though it challenged his rational understanding of how photographs worked. What if Rose had somehow impressed herself onto the photographic plate more strongly than the others? What if extreme emotion, fear, anger, desperation could affect the way light and chemistry interacted at the moment of exposure? It sounded absurd, like something from a ghost story rather than photographic science. Yet he couldn't explain what he was seeing any other way. The restoration should have clarified the 5 family members and perhaps revealed background details previously obscured. It should not have revealed an entirely separate figure positioned among them, with an expression suggesting she was experiencing something fundamentally different from the formal posing of the others. If you're enjoying this video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Eleanor called him one evening, her voice shaken. She had been to the site of the old Whitmore estate, which had been converted into a small historical museum in the 1970s. In the garden, the stone fountain still stood, though weathered and damaged by time. She had stood there at dusk, looking at the spot where Rose would have been found, and she had felt something she couldn't quite articulate. A presence, a weight in the air, a sense that something unresolved lingered there still. "She's still there," Eleanor whispered over the phone. "Not as a ghost. I don't mean that. But the injustice of what happened to her, the lies told to cover it up, that's still there, waiting to be acknowledged." Thomas looked at the photograph pinned to his wall, at Rose's pale face emerging from the space between the living, and wondered if Eleanor was right. Perhaps some wrongs leave an impression that time cannot erase, waiting in the shadows for someone to finally see them clearly. Thomas made a decision that would either provide answers or deepen the mystery beyond any hope of understanding. He contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a colleague who specialized in forensic photograph analysis and taught at MIT. If anyone could provide a scientific explanation for what he was seeing, it would be Sarah. He sent her the original degraded scan and the AI-restored version without explaining the context, asking only for her professional assessment of the restoration's accuracy and whether the revealed figure could be an artifact of the AI processing. Sarah's response came 3 days later, and it was not what Thomas had expected. She had analyzed both images using multiple forensic techniques, examining pixel patterns, light consistency, shadow analysis, and chemical degradation patterns in the original. Her conclusion was simultaneously reassuring and deeply troubling. The 6th figure was not an AI artifact or hallucination. Someone had been present in the original photograph all along, but had become nearly invisible through a combination of chemical degradation and the specific way the photographic emulsion had failed over time. But Sarah's analysis revealed something even more unusual. The light falling on Rose's figure came from a slightly different angle than the light on the Whitmore family members, as though she had been photographed at a different time of day, or as though light behaved differently around her. The shadows she cast, barely visible in the high-resolution analysis, didn't quite match the shadows cast by the others. "This is the strangest photograph I've ever analyzed," Sarah wrote. "Everything about it suggests a single exposure taken at one moment in time, yet the optical data for this 6th figure is subtly inconsistent with the others. I have no scientific explanation for this. If I didn't know better, I'd say this person was present but somehow existing in a slightly different moment than the others, as though the photograph captured multiple temporal layers simultaneously." And Thomas read the email 3 times, his scientific training warring with the implications of what Sarah was suggesting. Multiple temporal layers? That wasn't possible. Photography captured a single moment, light entering a lens, exposing a chemical emulsion, creating a permanent record of one instant in time. Yet here was forensic evidence suggesting something more complex. He decided to conduct his own experiment. Using specialized software, he analyzed the chemical composition of different areas of the original photograph through spectroscopic data embedded in the high-resolution scan. The silver halide crystals in the areas containing the Whitmore family showed normal degradation patterns consistent with a photograph exposed in 1905 and aged naturally over 119 years. The area where Rose appeared showed something different. The silver crystals there had degraded in an unusual pattern, as though they had been exposed to some form of energy or stress that the rest of the photograph hadn't experienced. It reminded Thomas of photographs he had seen from early radiation experiments, images where radioactive materials had created ghostly impressions on photographic plates through means other than visible light. But there was no radioactive source at the Whitmore estate in 1905. No scientific explanation for why one portion of the photograph would show this type of anomalous exposure pattern. Thomas shared his findings with Eleanor, who had continued her investigation in Massachusetts. She had located something extraordinary, a second photograph from the Whitmore estate, taken just 2 weeks after Rose's death in October 1905. This image showed the same garden, the same fountain, but no people, just an empty landscape. When Thomas applied the same AI restoration process to this second photograph, something appeared near the fountain. Not a clear figure like in the family portrait, but a distortion in the image, a blur that seemed to resist the AI's attempts to clarify it, as though something was there that the technology couldn't quite resolve into coherent form. "It's like an echo," Thomas told Eleanor during one of their frequent phone calls. The first photograph captured her clearly because she was a live, present part of that moment, even if she wasn't supposed to be in the frame. The second one, taken after her death, shows something else, something that my scientific training tells me shouldn't be there, but that the photographic evidence suggests is real. Eleanor had been digging deeper into family records. She found a letter from Catherine Whitmore to her sister, dated November 1905, just a month after Rose's death. The letter's tone was anxious, almost frightened. "The servants refused to work in the garden after dark," Catherine had written. "They claim to see lights near the fountain, to hear sounds that have no source. James insists it is superstition and foolishness, but I confess I feel uneasy there myself. Sometimes I think I see movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turn, there is nothing. Mary Sullivan gave her notice yesterday, and 2 others are threatening to leave. James has forbidden any talk of the incident with the girl, but I fear the household will never feel peaceful again." Thomas examined both photographs side by side on his monitors. The family portrait from spring 1905, with Rose's face emerging from between the living figures, her eyes holding that unsettling intensity. The garden landscape from autumn 1905, with its unexplainable distortion near the fountain where Rose had died. If you're enjoying this video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Dr. Chen called him directly, something she rarely did. She had continued analyzing the photographs and had discovered something else. Using advanced imaging techniques that could detect minute variations in the photographic emulsion, she had found what appeared to be fingerprints on the original photograph, not on the surface, but somehow embedded in the emulsion itself, as though someone had touched the plate while it was being exposed or immediately after. "The placement is strange," Sarah explained. "The fingerprints are in the area where this 6th figure appears. It's as though someone reached into the frame during the exposure, but that's impossible. The exposure time for cameras in 1905 was only a few seconds at most. If someone had reached into the frame, we'd see their hand clearly in the image, and the rest of the photograph would show motion blur." Thomas thought about Margaret Whitmore's diary entry that Eleanor had found, about her feeling that Rose was somehow part of that moment, even though she stood outside the frame. What if Rose hadn't been outside the frame at all? What if she had been there in the garden, watching the family pose, and something about that moment, the weight of what was to come, the tension between her and the family, the unresolved situation with Henry, had caused her image to impress itself onto the photographic plate in a way that shouldn't have been possible. He had no scientific explanation. Every principle of photography he understood said this couldn't happen. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Thomas printed both photographs and arranged them on his desk, studying them for patterns, for clues, for anything that might help him understand what he was seeing. As night fell over Portland, he sat alone in his office, the only light coming from his monitors, and wondered if there were aspects of reality that technology was only beginning to help us perceive. Not supernatural forces or paranormal phenomena, but natural processes so subtle, so rare, that science hadn't yet developed the framework to understand them. The photographs lay before him, holding their secrets, revealing just enough to suggest profound mysteries without ever quite providing complete answers. Rose Callahan's face stared out from 1905, captured by technology that wouldn't exist for another 119 years, waiting for someone to finally see her clearly and acknowledge what had been hidden for so long. 3 months after beginning the restoration of the Whitmore family photograph, Thomas found himself standing in the garden of what had once been their estate. The Victorian mansion was now a small museum dedicated to early 20th century Massachusetts life, maintained by the local historical society. Eleanor had arranged this visit, believing that seeing the location in person might provide some final clarity to their investigation. It was a cold April morning, and the garden looked different from how it appeared in the 1905 photograph. The rose bushes had been replaced with more modern landscaping, the layout altered by decades of changing tastes and purposes. But the stone fountain remained, weathered and cracked, water no longer flowing from its ornate spouts. Thomas stood near the fountain, trying to position himself where the photographer would have stood in 1905. Eleanor stood beside him, holding a printed copy of the restored photograph. Around them, the spring morning was quiet except for birds and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. "This is where she died," Eleanor said softly, looking at the fountain. "Right here where the family had posed for their portrait just months before. Do you think she knew, when she watched them posing that spring day, that this was where it would end?" Thomas had no answer. He had brought his camera, a high-end digital device capable of capturing minute details. He took several photographs of the fountain, of the garden, of the space where the Whitmore family had stood. Later, he would examine them closely, looking for what? He wasn't sure anymore. The museum curator, an elderly man named Robert Finch, joined them in the garden. Eleanor had told him about their research into Rose Callahan's death, and he had spent the past week searching through the museum's archives for any additional information. "I found something you should see," Robert said, leading them into the museum's research room. He placed a worn ledger on the table, the estate's household accounts from 1905. Flipping through the pages, he pointed to entries from October. "Here," he said, "October 15th, 1905. A payment of $50 to a local physician, Dr. Henry Morrison. The note says, 'Consultation regarding household matter.' That's a substantial sum for 1905, equivalent to perhaps $2,000 today. The next entry, dated October 18th, is a payment to the constable's office, listed as administrative fee." Eleanor leaned closer. 3 days between the doctor's visit and the payment to the constable. Rose died on October 16th, according to the newspaper article. "The family was paying to control the narrative," Thomas said. "The doctor to provide a cause of death that would satisfy the authorities, the constable to ensure the investigation didn't look too closely." Robert nodded. "There's more." I found correspondence from 1906 between James Whitmore and a Boston lawyer regarding the sale of the estate. Whitmore wrote that he wanted to leave Massachusetts due to unfortunate associations with the property that make it untenable for continued family residence. He sold everything at a significant loss and moved the family to San Francisco within 3 months. Thomas photographed the ledger entries, adding them to his growing file of evidence. Yet even with all this documentation, the financial records, the letters, the diary entries, the newspaper articles, the central mystery remained. Not the question of what happened to Rose Callahan. That was becoming increasingly clear. The mystery was what the photograph had captured and how technology had revealed it 119 years later. Leave a comment about what you think about this story. That evening, back in his Portland office, Thomas compiled everything into a comprehensive report. The facts were straightforward. Rose Callahan, a young woman employed at the Whitmore estate, had died under suspicious circumstances that were covered up by the wealthy family. The evidence suggested she had confronted them about mistreatment, and that confrontation had ended tragically. But the photograph that remained inexplicable. Thomas had consulted with 3 more photographic experts, shared the images with colleagues across the country, even reached out to researchers studying anomalous phenomena in historical photographs. None could provide a satisfactory explanation for how Rose's image had been captured in that family portrait, when she presumably wasn't part of the posed group. The theories ranged from the prosaic to the impossible. Perhaps she had been standing nearby, and the photographer's instructions to remain still had caused her image to impress faintly on the plate, only to be revealed by modern AI restoration. Perhaps there was a technical flaw in the camera or development process that had created a double exposure. Perhaps the AI, trained on countless period photographs, had somehow constructed her image from fragmentary data that suggested a human presence. Or perhaps, as Eleanor believed, there were aspects of photography that science didn't yet understand, ways that emotion, trauma, and unresolved injustice could interact with the photographic process to create impressions that persisted across time, waiting for technology advanced enough to reveal them. Thomas had always been a rationalist, someone who believed in measurable phenomena and reproducible results. Yet here was something that challenged that worldview. The photograph existed. The forensic analysis confirmed that Rose's image was present in the original, not an AI hallucination. The optical inconsistencies that Dr. Chen had documented were real, measurable, scientifically verifiable, yet they made no sense within the understood principles of how photography worked. He thought about quantum mechanics, about experiments showing that observation could affect the behavior of particles, about the strange ways that reality at the smallest scales didn't conform to human intuition. What if photographs at some level were quantum events, capturing not just light, but information about the moment in ways that classical physics couldn't explain? It was speculation, nothing more. But it was the only framework Thomas could imagine that might accommodate what he was seeing. Eleanor called him one last time before he closed the investigation. She had spoken with the museum board, and they had agreed to create a permanent exhibit about Rose Callahan, telling her story and acknowledging what had happened to her. The restored photograph would be displayed alongside historical documentation, creating a record that would ensure she wasn't forgotten again. Maybe that's what the photograph was waiting for, Eleanor said. Not a scientific explanation, but acknowledgement, recognition, the truth finally being told. Thomas looked at the image on his screen one final time. Rose Callahan's face, emerging from between the Whitmore family members, her eyes intense and focused. He had spent 3 months trying to understand how her image had appeared there, how the AI had revealed what had been hidden for over a century. He realized he might never have a complete answer. Some mysteries existed at the intersection of science and human experience. in places where measurable phenomena and unmeasurable emotions overlapped in ways that neither discipline alone could fully comprehend. The photograph remained, a document of an injustice, a testament to the persistence of truth, and perhaps evidence of something science had yet to understand about how moments of profound emotional intensity could leave impressions that transcended normal physical processes. Thomas archived his files, backed up the images, and prepared his final report. The case of the Whitmore family photograph would remain in his records as the strangest restoration he had ever conducted. The one that had revealed not just hidden details in an old image, but the limits of his own understanding about what photographs could capture and what technology could reveal. Rose Callahan's story was no longer hidden. Whether her appearance in the photograph was the result of some unknown photographic phenomenon, some quantum interaction between consciousness and chemistry, or something else entirely, her face now looked out from the restored image as evidence that some truths refused to stay buried, waiting across decades or centuries for someone to finally see them clearly. The museum in Massachusetts prepared its exhibit. The photograph hung on the wall, restored to clarity, showing 5 members of the Whitmore family posed formally in their garden, and a 6th figure, pale, intense, impossible, standing among them, her presence a question that might never be fully answered, but could no longer be denied. The story of the 1905 Whitmore family photograph raises questions that sit uncomfortably at the boundary between science and mystery. Through advanced AI restoration, a hidden presence was revealed. Rose Callahan, a young woman whose death was covered up and whose story was deliberately erased from the historical record. The forensic evidence confirms that her image was present in the original photograph, not created by the restoration process. Yet how she came to be captured in that frame, standing among a family that would soon conspire to hide the circumstances of her death, remains unexplained by conventional photographic science. Was it simply a case of degraded emulsion, hiding details that were always present? Or did something about that moment in 1905, the weight of what was to come, the tension between Rose and the family, the injustice that was already taking shape, impress itself onto the photographic plate in ways that science doesn't yet understand? Thomas Brennan continues his work in photographic restoration, but he has never encountered another image like the Whitmore photograph. Eleanor Whitmore visits the museum exhibit regularly, standing before the restored image and the documentation of Rose's story, ensuring that this time the truth persists. The photograph itself remains, a window into 1905 that shows more than it should, that reveals more than seems possible, that challenges our understanding of what images can capture and what technology can reveal. Rose Callahan looks out from between the posed figures, her presence a reminder that some stories refuse to be silenced, waiting in the shadows of history for someone to finally see them clearly. Whether her appearance in the photograph represents an unexplained photographic phenomenon, evidence of processes science has yet to understand, or something that exists beyond current frameworks of explanation, may never be definitively known. What is certain is that technology designed to clarify the past sometimes reveals mysteries that deepen rather than resolve, opening questions rather than providing answers. The truth about what happened to Rose Callahan is now known and acknowledged. But the question of how her image came to be captured in that family photograph, waiting 119 years for AI restoration to reveal her presence, remains suspended in that uncertain space where evidence and explanation refuse to align, a mystery hidden in plain sight, revealed at last but never fully understood. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think really happened with Rose's image in the photograph, and whether you believe there are aspects of photography that science hasn't yet explained. If you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future videos exploring the mysteries hidden in old photographs and the stories that technology helps us uncover from the past.